Okay, we're on the air. Welcome to our Mojolicious night. This is a joint presentation with the TechKeka meetup group, and I will hand it over to Alex Beamish.
Thank you to Mozilla.
Yeah, thanks a lot to Mozilla for providing us this really great space.
Yeah, what a beautiful space. My name is Alex Beamish, and tonight I'm going to be talking about Mojolicious Lite. So I've used it for a couple of small projects, but nothing big. So this really is kind of on the intro level. So to jump right in, web programming is hard. Well, it used to be hard. Now with frameworks,
No, speak up.
Speak up.
The fan is loud.
Fan is loud. Okay, I can project. That's no problem.
Oh.
Hello, hello. It's okay. I'll just talk. Is there a button on the side? Hello. This is what you deal with when you're the first presenter.
All the bugs.
All the free entertainment.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry,
It's okay.
I can email our tech guy.
All right, so I'll project, I guess. So it used to be you use CGI, you printed out HTML. It was hilarious, and what a nightmare when you decide you want to change something. Even with templates, it was a bit of a mess. So with frameworks, it's a lot easier. Yes, there's new stuff to learn, always new stuff. This is, well, I guess I don't need to explain any of this to you guys, but you need to learn the new stuff, and you'll be that guy. And as well, CGI.PM was deprecated, what, a year ago now? Not Core, yeah, sorry. Not Core, you can still use it. People will frown. People won't come to your tea parties. It'll be bad. So Mojolicious is, so Sebastian Rydell, I probably got spelled that wrong, finished with Catalyst and started Mojolicious. I don't really know a lot about that, but it's quite similar to Catalyst. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to do when this presentation was much more ambitious was compare Catalyst and Mojolicious and see how they were similar, because they're written by the same guy. They must be similar, but we ended up with this, which is a little simpler. I'm still kind of interested to find out. Similar to Dancer, where, well, similar to Dancer, I don't want to spoil my next slides. And it's a pretty active community. People are updating it. The most recent update last week, there may be a newer one. So this is my Hello World program. So this is very similar if you're a Dancer. It's basically you click the root and you send out the text that says Hello World. What this is like, and you start. I've taken out strict and use warnings just in case anyone's jumpy. And so when you run that locally, so here I am running it as a daemon. It starts automatically on port 3000, and then you. I am stealing my thunder again. It starts a daemon for the to run the web server. Oh, I thought I was going to get some screenshots. Okay, I guess they must be later. So so that starts it on 3000. Later on, I'll talk about Morbo, which is a little more clever. So that if you make a change to the file, you can try the change right away instead of stopping and starting it. So, and there are a couple of choices in production. Versions of daemon, 3.4, Hypno code, which is pretty cool, or flat. And since this is a presentation, I put a picture of Hypnocode in there. I believe it's a Simpsons reference.
Futurama.
Futurama, right. Okay, Matt Groening. Yeah. You're going to pass parameters. I sure hope this one has got a screenshot, because it's going to look kind of embarrassing. Okay, so here we go. So here we are calling it without parameters, and over on the other side we've got real parameters. So I'm just going to go back. So you can see we're getting the parameter, the user parameter, or we settle on default user, and that's the text that we render out. So that just pops up like that. That's pretty cool. And you can also get it to do links and page templates. So over here, we've got a template for index.html and a template for hello.html. And this magic lets you just puts in the right thing for the links, so that when you run it, you get ready-made links. And if you click on the hello link, you get hello world. Hello world is in the hello page. And this is forms that submit to themselves. So you've got a form over there on the right with a text field and a submit button, and you've got a confirmation field if there's something there, which means it starts out looking like that on the left, and once you click on the button, it looks like that on the right. So right, that's for a put and not a post. Really, that's interesting. Anyway, I got the screenshots when I ran the code, so that must be how it works. Session variables. Too bad Alan isn't here because he was asking about that. But you can put in a counter into the session, and Mojolicious will take care of all that. And so here I've shown the counter, and then you can see there's a cookie in there, but you're not going to be able to drag that value out of there. So after a refresh, you can see the counter increases, and the cookie is still some gibberish. So that's it's relatively secure. Uploading files is one that I always thought was magic when I was first doing web development. So again, this is a pretty standard form for upload, file field submit button, and it's checking to make sure that the file isn't too big. And I think it's a 10 megabyte limit. I have to look that up. And there it is, doing an upload. And I'm just finishing off. I talked about a fake Twitter application that I developed. It started off as an API, then I had a web pages. So this is one of the test scripts. So basically, you just use your usual test more and test mojo. I required in the API here. So I created a test object and then just started sending stuff to him. This particular API, I'm getting JSON back, so I'm sending stuff off and I'm checking that the results are of the correct form. And the whole Mojo Catalyst thing. Yeah, my last experience with Catalyst was not good. It was this gigantic hunk of code that was somewhat impenetrable. So you know, I'll pass along that. Event-driven programming. You can write APIs in it. You can write a whole website in it. Under active development, CGI application. That's another one I'll compare, but that's such an old piece of code. I don't think anybody uses that anymore. I do. You do? You use Catalyst. You use CGI application.
Well, I got a lot of old code on CGI applications that I'm interested in importing, and it actually was super easy to convert it to Black. So still, it's very minimal, but for what it does, it's fine. Oh yeah, I mean, I developed something probably 10 years ago in CGI application and thought it was awesome, but that was 10 years ago. At the time, it was cutting edge. It was like, this is amazing. So that's basically it. Okay, that's like my 6 or 7 minute presentation. And if you have any ideas for things that we're missing in this, I'll do another presentation in 6 months. How did your Twitter app come?
Unfortunately, I got to a certain point with a Twitter app where I looked at the API that I designed and thought, oh, this sucks. And thought, I should clean it up or structure the API, and then I was busy doing other things. So I haven't gotten back to that. But basically, I've got the whole DBIX class chunk, which I'm happy with. but the way the API accesses the DBX class, I'm not happy with. And I think what I'd like to go back and is to look and see how Twitter does it, and maybe model the second version of the API more like Twitter does it, more like how Twitter does it. Because I think that would be more a better test. Alan?
What was your learning path to picking up the Mojolicious? I've been through the Mojo casts and through the tutorials that they go through this and
Yeah.
and I think it found it confusing, especially the fact that they started with light. I know that by what was before.
Well, you can do a lot of stuff in light.
That's it. Essentially, what I was trying to do was to convert an application that's written in a framework that's by those guys from here, which works very differently. And it's really confusing trying to the light rather than the
Well, the way I started,
What else did you
well, we were just talking about this fake Twitter application, and I think everybody must have been drinking the same water supply 6 months or 8 months ago because there are a couple people who to demonstrate that kind of thing. So I just started with a very simple thing. I built a tweet class in DBX class, wrote tests against that, and then wrote a user class, and I think there were some retweets were a special case of a tweet, and so on and so on. So I built up my DBX, I built up the data model first, and then I wrote an API that would fetch tweets from the class, from the database, basically. And they just kept on writing tests and expanding and writing more code. And eventually I had something that had 1,200 tests and everything worked. But then I decided I didn't like the way it was laid out. But I didn't really have a plan. It was really kind of a learning experience for me, and I did it about a week. So was there any specific thing that you were stuck on?
I think one of the things was trying to figure out what the flow of exchanges should be. Essentially what you do with a website is you're going down a path.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to model that and model those exchanges and then what the paths could be.
Well, you could set up a very simple application that has just a couple of links on it, like this, and then just do very, very simple template files just to dummy up your website. So instead of having a banner and maybe a sidebar and a footer and all that other stuff, just concentrate on the central page, the bare content, and get that working. Get all the links to work there.
Try to give good examples. I find plagiarism is always by far the easiest.
Well, if you're talking about plagiarism, look no further than this, because I've basically taken this from the Mojolicious guides. I thought they were really good examples.
There's also, like, if you go to the meta CPAN, GitHub repository, there's a site called GitHub meets CPAN, and you just grab the repository. It's a Mojo app as well. So I can send you the link later, but it's like you would need to install Mongo to get it to work, but it's a good tool. Just a simple example.
Dave. It's actually very similar. That's a good question, and I should have explained that. It's actually very similar to Template Toolkit. The only difference is that instead of square brackets, you're using angle brackets, and that seems to be pretty much it. Now, of course, there's some differences. This link to keyword is that's specific to Mojolicious Lite, and perhaps Mojolicious. But apart from that, it's very similar to Template Toolkit. And that's just, what's that?
Essentially Perl. You can use any Perl.
And yeah, exactly. And you can throw Perl in there, and that works as well. In fact, that would be good for the presentation that I'm trying to get out of in 6 months' time, which would talk about those advanced features. But it's really terrific. So, you know, you've got part of it is figuring out how to build an application in Mojolicious Lite, and part of it is understanding what additional little bits Mojolicious Lite has added to the page templates, so there is a bit of a learning curve to get to this stuff. But to start off on this is pretty simple. You know, if all you want is a really simple page, then there you go. And there are other tools. There's one that I didn't mention, which is as you build this script and make it bigger and bigger, you can run a command, which I knew what it was. You can run a command and it'll basically take all the templates out and put them in their own subdirectory as separate files, and leave just all these roots in place. So then, as you make the thing bigger and more complex, there's a tool already done for that. I basically put this together Sunday night. I've done all the research for it, but I put it together Sunday night. So I haven't taken this on the road. So this is a relatively untested presentation. Oh, I have to take. I'll come back to you, Alan.
They have got extensive documentation, except that it's not entirely clear how to read it. Did you read through their examples in particular? It's not clear whether they're providing multiple different examples of syntax, or whether there's some kind of flow or anything. Read that before?
I think there are different examples depending on what they want to talk about. You know, and a lot of these examples are not really related. They're like, oh, we want to show links. Okay, here's how we're gonna show links. And then we go down a little further. Oh yeah, we want to show forms. So then they jump over the forms. So, you know, there's some similarities here, but you know, there's a root here, and then there's a file template here. I mean, I would have put it all in one column, but then it would have been tiny. Nobody would have been able to read it. So that's you know, this is basically an example boiled down to its shortest form. And there was a bit of a I had to be clever to squeeze some of these into small enough so they fit all on one slide. Maybe we can talk later about that. Dave, what was your other question?
So one of my irritations with Catalyst
Yep.
is the C context object,
Yep.
which I've seen used for particularly C forward. So
I wonder what you're talking
I don't know what you're talking about. Can't tell JP. Is it still called the context object? Is it pared down, or redirect to, for example, I assume you're issuing like a 301 redirect, but how do you forward to another,
about. To forward to, I think you probably do forward to.
Yeah. So that's actually redirecting. You pass control URL without doing without hitting the browser, just move me to this.
I'm sure you can. Yeah. I'm sure you can. And that's another thing I should put into the second presentation. And I haven't looked inside the context object. That's one of those things where you know, what's been seen cannot be unseen. And I'm sure it's some gigantic object with, you know, methods in there and all kinds of other crazy stuff. The thing works, it's very quick. Oh yeah, another thing I wanted to show was what happens when you've done something wrong and you get this really good debug screen explaining everything that went wrong and here all of the fields and everything. Very handy. Fun.
In the form, you just have to send some. Is that an accident, or because you were saying that the template language has taggle brackets?
Yeah.
Those are tag helpers. So
Yeah, so you'll see the percent sign is in front of the Perl code, and percent equals is in front of what's going onto the web page. I believe that's the way that works.
Yeah, so yeah, the percent equals are the helpers, I guess, and the percent is just the raw Perl code.
Yeah. And yeah, so you can see for this one here, this is a Perl code. So it's basically saying the percent says, okay, the rest of the line, do that. Here, we've got this confirmation that's being included into the HTML. So then you've got the angle back to the side.
So it should be percent equal on the end line here at the bottom.
This is
So that goes with the beginning.
this is template code. This is template code. This is template code. This is stuff that's actually going out to. It's also going into right. It's also template code. And it also needs a.
Because the form for nothing has to begin.
So the end is name, but it's.
It actually doesn't. It doesn't in the examples. The end doesn't have equals. So.
I think is the equal sign one of the number of qualifiers.
Yeah, I can't remember. What I did was I played with these examples and then packed them away back in August. And when I said, well, I'll do an intro to Mojo Talk. And then was going to do it in September, and then it was going until October. So when I pulled it out on Sunday, I was digging through this old code and running it, and then copying and pasting the code on this presentation. So from what I remember from Sunday, which was only 3 days ago, this code worked.
I think it will work. I've seen like all the examples, a whole bunch of examples like on the Mojo site that just have their end laid out like that. So
Yeah.
You use the equal sign if you want to out something to the HTML output. But if you're just doing like command control stuff, you don't need the equal sign. It's the angle that's output.
Yeah, so these three statements, the Mojolicious are going to have to deal with though, because they have to do something with the form for. This one is a text field, this one is a submit button, so I have to do some magic there. This one is, it doesn't really have to do, it has to spend less work on it. It's that one. Less work, less work, less work. Yeah. Again, I'm certainly not an expert on this, on Mojolicious later, just, but because it was a new framework, I wanted to get familiar with it, learn some new stuff. I believe so, yeah. Yeah. I was really impressed because UTF-8 is one of those, you know, it's a little scary topic. It's like, wow, it actually works. Yep. There it is running on local host. And you can see the intro to Mojo Talk. I did this all in Google presentations. Very handy. All right, if that's it, I'm done. Where's the next victim? Present. Don't forget your. You need to mount ejector. Is it E? Yeah, just click on that guy.
Somebody has to go.
There we go. Yeah, that should be good enough. Okay. You can do yours next, I think, because you're going to be covering some things that I'll be using as well. Like a full screen. I'll do. Got the wrong glasses on here. View. Full screen. No, it's still at the top.
My name is Pete. Online, you might know it as Suffix. And you can get all of these slides at tpm2015suffix.com. And need somebody who knows how to use a Mac.
Oh, what's we need to
I
do?
don't know.
Presentation online, and you're waiting for a minute.
No, it should have been loaded.
It should be.
All right. If you have a question, just ask. And a lot of people, when they talk about Mojolicious, they think it's just a web framework. But it actually includes a lot of modules that you can use for other tasks that really don't have much to do with web. And here we have some of the examples. You have an HTML parser, you have a user agent, there's a bunch of utility functions, and they're all included in the Mojolicious distribution. And you can go on cpan and just look up what kind of modules it contains. First, we have module collection. You can think of it as a Perl array that you can call methods on. On line number 1, you can see how we can create a new module collection object. You just pass whatever items you want it to contain to the new method. On line number 3, you can see how you can grab some of the items using a regular expression. Then we call join with a comma and say method printed on screen. Line number 4 shows you the same thing done in pure Perl. And you can see I use the module collection object as an array reference, and you can do that. And lines number 7 and 9 and 10 show the same thing done with module collection on line number 7 and pure Perl on the other lines. So you can see you can save some time. And usually I don't use it like this, like it's not a substitute for arrays. It's more useful when you return it from a method or something. As you know, we have lots of util list modules, and you can't always remember which function comes from each module. So you might find that if you use module collection, you'd have to look up dozens of modules. Next, we have an HTML parser. I think it's the best parser on cpan. By far, it's the easiest to use. And the way you reference elements is you just use CSS selectors. On line number 1, you can see how you can create that object. Just give it the HTML code you want to parse to the new method. And on line number 2, we use the add method, which gives us just one element. In this case, we find the title element. Then we call all text to get all the text inside of it, of that element. And we print it on screen. On line number 4, it's a more complex example. We find all links on the page. Then we call each method, and we just use the map to get all the links to all the href attributes. And we can also modify HTML using the same object. On line number 7, we find each paragraph, and we give each method a callback, which calls that method, the wrap method, on each of the paragraphs, and we wrap it in a div. On line number 8, I just use say DOM object, and it actually automatically stringifies to whatever HTML it contains. And on line number 10, part of it you already seen in module collection, and what actually happens is the find method returns a module collection object. Each element of which is a module DOM object containing just one item that they found. So in this case, on line number 1, we collect a table cell element that has a class attribute set to name. And then on each one, we call the map method from the module collection object. And in this case, we call the all text method on each one of them. We get a new module collection object just with the text, and the rest is just operating on that text and printing it. And that's all the all the methods that module DOM object contains. And a lot of them return either a module DOM, another module DOM object with a subset of HTML, or a module collection object. So it's pretty easy to work out what you get from the method. Next, we have a module user agent, which is something you can use to access resources. It's non-blocking, and I think you will know how to use the non-blocking portion, but in this case, I'm just going to show the blocking way to do it. It's pretty easy to use. Line number 4, a simple GET request. If you want to change the HTTP headers that you are sending with your request, just pass them as a hash reference, as you can see on line number 8. Then on line number 12, we're doing a post, and to do just a regular post, you use the form key and give it a hash reference of your query parameters. And you can also send JSON if you're communicating with some API that wants JSON. Instead of using the form key, on line number 15, you can see we're using JSON key. And what that does, it automatically encodes in JSON. So you don't have to worry about that. We're checking errors. That's the most complete way to check it. It's kind of verbose. What the post or and other methods return is the transaction object. I'm not going to cover that. It's something that you will see a lot with Mojolicious apps. But that object has a success method. If it's successful, just call the response and body and we're printing it. Or if it's an error on line number 8, it might be an HTTP error, like 400 error. Or it might be a network error, which we handle on lines number 9 and on line number 10. Now, that's a lot of typing, and sometimes you don't really care what kind of error you got. Just, if it's an error, it's an error. So you can just call on line number 1 here, on the response object, given by the res method, we call in DOM to get the module DOM object. We call it at and get in the text. So now, if the request fails, by the time we get to the text method, you will get a runtime error saying you can't call that method on an undefined value. And that's one way to get an error. You can also catch it with an eval or some other method. Yeah, give your own error. So you don't have to write a lot to catch errors. And if you go with this way and you deal with HTTPS, you're sure to install that module IO socket SSL, because if you don't have it, the message about it will be over here at line number 10. And if you don't check for it, it will just fail silently. You don't know why. So let's look what it returns. That's one statement to get something from the page and output text. And if we look at it, the get method gives us a transaction object, which has a res method for response. And that method contains DOM method that gives us a module DOM object, which we've seen from before. So, and you already know how to use that. We call find and map and all that. So you can see, yes.
Are there alternative? We've got multiple lines down there. Are they alternative methods so that, like one's got get line 2 res method, or there's some continuation?
Yeah. You can. This is exactly the same as this, so you can split it on multiple lines to make it more readable. The Perl part, the values is the same. So as you can see, all of these modules, they all made to integrate with each other, and they work really well when you use them like that. And so say if you're working with an API, another web page, here on line number 4, instead of calling DOM method to get the page HTML, we call it JSON method. And what it does, it decodes that JSON automatically for you. So on line number 5, you can just access it as a normal Perl data structure. Pop quiz, but I'm going to give you all the answers. So this is something that I'm sure you've done lots of times. You read a file into a variable. There are lots of ways to do it. Pure Perl, broken module, file slurp. You can use path tiny, but now you have word path in your code when you're just dealing with files. If you want to dump some data while debugging, there's a whole bunch of options. If you want to trim white space, that's the common way to do it, which is really ugly. Escaping stuff, HTML or URLs, there's a whole bunch of modules. And they do pretty much the same thing. So Mojolicious actually gives you a module to do all of those common features, common functions. And it's called Mojuutil. Here we're doing what I just showed you. Like line number 3, we're written in the file, slurp, dumper, dumps the data, similar to the data dumper. Line number 5, trim, that trims white space in the front and at the end of the string. Line number 6, URL encode. Number 7, HTML encoding. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different functions that that module provides, like encoding, dealing with files and strings. So if you can look it up in, yeah, you can add a method to some package.
That's, wow, that is a dangerous.
So what does the deprecated function do?
I think when you call it, it will show you a message. Like if you want to tell the user that the user is something deprecated. I think it's just a word you're using deprecated pictures. So I don't know how much time I have.
Oh, you got time. You got time.
All right. All right. So there's another object, byte string. It's essentially a series of bytes, and you can call the methods from Mojuutil on that byte string. So on line number 1, we quote in a string, we print it with quotes. Line number 5, unquote, encode to UTF, encode to base 64, and just print it on screen. That's what that module provides. URL, you will build with this a lot with module applications because there are lots of helpers that return this object. The new method, just give it a string, it parses it. There's a whole bunch of methods to access the specific portion of the URL. And you can also change those portions or build a new URL by giving a variable to those methods. Module-based, if you use move, do you know what move is? Right, so that's even simpler than move. It pretty much all it does, it gives you the has function that creates attributes. Lines 1 through 5, we have a class. We use on line number 2, we use module-base-base that lets you create a class. And then you use a has method to define the attributes. And you can also assign defaults. So for name, we assign young. For age and weight, we assign number 4. And then when we use it, you can change those attributes on line number 11, name, and we pass it as a key value there. Line number 12, we print age, and by default it's 4. Line number 15, we assign 3 to the age, 5 to the weight, and then we call age again to get the value. And as you can see, those attributes are chainable, so you can chain a whole bunch of them. And now, this is not included in the default Mojolicious distribution, but it is developed by one of the core team members. And this plugin, it lets you handle all of the resources like CSS, JavaScript, Sass, Less, CoffeeScript, and you can even do sprites. Here on line number 1, that's how you just include a plugin. That's the full Mojolicious application. And line number 3, that's how you assign a new asset. The key is the name of the asset, and then you give it a list of all the stuff you want to include. You can use external URLs; it will download it for you. Line number 6, you will include just the regular JavaScript file. Line number 7 will include a Kata script, which will be automatically parsed. And line number 8, we can include a whole bunch of files in a folder if we use the asterisk. Line number 13 shows you how you would refer to this asset in your template. You just use whatever you use as key. Here on line number 4, we use app.js, so that's what we use on the line number 13. And when you run your app, that asset will be changed to what you see on line 16. It will be changed to a script element. Yep.
Where does the asset live? Is it in memory? Or?
No, this one lives on disk.
So it actually gets written in disk?
Yeah, a packed folder. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just on line 8 where you're including a whole bunch of files for actually, what order I see? Is it sorted alphabetically, or is it?
I'm not sure. I would think it's alphabetically. If it's not, submit an issue on GitHub and we'll fix it. And somebody else have a question?
Yeah. Sorry, lots of thread. What is self?
Self, that's a Mojolicious controller. That's something you would have in your full app. If you're using Lite, just change self to app. The $self, just to plain app. Does it answer the question? Yeah.
At what point does the pack JS get muted? Is it like request? Is it when you file?
When you restart your app. Yeah.
It transparently handles 30 copies per
Yeah. Yeah.
and you can do this for SAS and less.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here is an example of CSS portion. You can see on line number 5 we have SAS. Same thing on line number 6 we have the multiple files. And what you see on line number 7 is sprites, a special URL that starts with sprites. And here it references a directory called images/UI. And in your template you reference the same as the JavaScript version, just asset, whatever the name is, and it gives you a link element. Now, does everybody know what a sprite is? Basically, a bunch of images collected into one big image, so you don't have to make tons of HTTP requests. So with Asset Pack, you don't have to build it yourself. You just save all those images in one folder. Reference that folder with sprites URL in your CSS, like line number 7, and it will scan that folder for images. It will combine all of them in one image, and it will generate the CSS. As you can see on line number 1, it uses the name of the folder for the class name, and on line number 3, the second class name is the name of the image. And so if you want to use sprites, all you have to do is save all the images in one folder, reference it in your asset pack, and when you write markup, you just use the class for the directory and the name of the image, and it will automatically set the size and change the correct background position. And that's really easy to use it. And you've seen I've included a bunch of files. When you're running in development mode, each of those files will generate its own script tag or its own link tag. But when it's in production mode, it will automatically minify everything it needs to minify and combine it into one file. So all you need to do is just one request for GS or CSS. And that's it. Yeah.
What was your learning path for this? There's a huge amount there.
Right.
You learned.
How I learned this? Well, first I found the Mojo down parser. And for about a year, heavily reduced the web portion. I was just using the modules included in it. And then I've read the tutorial on the Mojolicious website. And then I guess I just hanged out in the IRC room on ircperl.org/module. And anything that I didn't understand, I would just stop. And I think you mentioned that it was hard for you to switch between light and full app. Try to understand that the light app is pretty much the full app. Just there are lots of, for example, you know how you call app, like in this example, I said instead of self, you would call app. So that app object, essentially in Mojolite, provides you controller, Mojolicious controller object. And here the self method also provides the same object. So you would call that object. And here you have the plugin method on the controller. In your Lite app, you have the same method, but on the app thing, on the app function. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about how you deploy to production, like what web server you use?
Okay. Personally, I use Apache. I just set it up as a proxy, reverse proxy. And the Mojolicious app, I just run with Hypnotoad. Yeah.
About the user agent, is there first going to do cookie jars?
Yeah. Yeah.
And is the non-blocking? It's just kind of callback based.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You would just include the call, essentially include the callback after the URL or something like that.
The asset
manager,
does it also, when it does the JavaScript, even in production mode, provide a JavaScript app file?
Probably. I'm not sure.
Really, you can run it like uncompressed in that, but I'm just curious if you can have an app file.
Anybody else? All right, I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I actually learned quite a bit in that as well, so that was very good stuff. Just give me a couple of seconds to switch this over. Okay. Hi, everyone. I want to thank both the other speakers for their talks. There was some very interesting stuff there. What I've decided to do for my talk is to look at something that Mojolicious does different than the other frameworks, and that it does quite well, actually, which is event-driven programming in Mojolicious. So a bit of terminology. We've got event-driven programming. You might also know it as asynchronous programming. It's also sometimes called non-blocking programming. They all generally refer to pretty much the same thing. And what it comes down to is a process effectively can only do one thing at a time. And we often want to do multiple things so that our process isn't sitting there waiting for stuff to happen. We might make a call to do something, have to wait for a while, but it'd be nice if we can do other things at the same time. And common solutions for that is to fork off multiple processes, which has some problems, issues with tracking your process IDs and child children. You can do threads as well, which in Perl is probably not recommended. You could use non-blocking system calls and manage that yourself as well, and constantly remember to look to see if any of your file descriptors have some data waiting that you can read from. Or you can use an event loop. And in Perl, we have quite a few event loops to choose from. Some examples of event loops, your web browser and the JavaScript engine in your web browser is basically running as an event loop. Any sort of graphical user interface is effectively running within an event loop. And some of you guys might have played with Node.js, which is the big thing there, again, is asynchronous programming. Works with event loops. And Mojolicious also can work with event loops. So when we look at a web browser and we talk about an event loop, what we mean by that is that the event loop is tracking everything that's happening with in the browser. So it's looking for actions that are happening, like somebody clicking on a button or the mouse moving around and hovering over an item. But it can also be loading files. It can make a call to load a file in the background, but it doesn't sit there and wait for it to finish. It'll be told later on, execute a bit of code to handle that file that's now downloaded. If it's an image, it places it on the page, and it moves on. But it doesn't sit there and wait. It is constantly looping around and checking for these events to happen. And when it finds an event that has happened, it can trigger a callback. And we can register those callbacks to do what we want when something happens. So how does this work in Mojolicious? Actually, first of all, does everybody have a basic idea of how event loops work? Are there any questions on that? Or?
No questions.
No questions, okay. So Mojolicious actually has a built-in event loop. And in all the examples that we saw earlier, that event loop was running in the background, even though you don't necessarily have to use it. When your application starts up, it starts up an event loop, and when it finishes, it stops the event loop. It's there for you to use, but it's not necessary for you to even see it or deal with it. But you can. Now, this is only true if you use the built-in servers that Mojolicious provide, because if you're running your application through CGI, if you want to, or through Plaque or anything like that, it's not going to have the event loop built into it. You need to use a specific server for it, like Morbo, which is the development server, or Hypnotoad, which is a forking multi-worker production-based system. So you can still put Apache in front of it as a reverse proxy, but your application needs to run on a Mojolicious-based server in order for you to take advantage of this event loop programming. I believe if you're running it as a straight CGI, it still starts the event loop, but it finishes right afterwards, so it doesn't end up doing much for you. So let's look at a quick example. This is what I'm trying to do here. You'll see a sleep call in there, which obviously you would never do, but I'm trying to show a slow process. You're taking an action that requires the system to wait for something to respond. Okay, so we're simulating that waiting period by just doing a sleep. So we have a regular get, we sleep for a second, and then we just render a JSON file with a random number. So if we run that very quickly, this is, we can use Morbo and run that script. So what we can see when we run that, it waits about a second and then it returns us some JSON. Very simple, doesn't do a whole lot. If I refresh it, waits a second and does its thing. So if we look at, we run a benchmark against it, just using AB. I'll open up 10 connections and make 10 requests. So how long is that going to take when I execute that? 10 seconds. And why is it going to take 10 seconds? Because I'm doing them serially. I have one process running, and I'm trying to make 10 requests to it, and it's queuing up all 10 of them, and it's running the first one, sleeping for a second, returning the result. Then it goes to the next one, and it keeps doing that. So we're blocking our process from doing that. And you were exactly right, it takes 10 seconds to do that. Now, you're probably telling me, why would you run that on a development server? Why don't we run it under Hypnotoad, and we can run 10 workers? So that should improve the performance of this app. If we go back here, shut this off, and go to our, sorry, I need to run it under Hypnotoad. So now we're running the same application, that very simple one under Hypnotoad. And if I run it now, how long is it going to take? Actually still takes a little while. So it takes between 3 and 4 seconds because it has to dole out the requests to the different workers, and it probably hasn't spun enough up to get started. But it's better. It is much better. But we can improve this by using an event loop and not waiting for this service to complete. So if we go back to our we go back here, sorry, and instead we use Mojo's event loop to do this. Instead of using a sleep, what I'm using is an event timer. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a timer that's going to last for 1 second, and once that second finishes, I'm going to call my callback. And at this point is when I call my render and render my random. You'll notice there's one extra line there, which is see render later. Now what's happening here is when you execute this function or this subroutine, it's going to get to here and it's going to execute. And because this is a non-blocking call, it's going to complete instantly. And the function finishes, and Mojolicious is expecting us to return something to send to the user. A template, it's expecting us to render something. We don't have it yet because we're still working on it. So what we tell it is we're going to render this later. At some point in the future, your data will get there, and we will send a response. When we do that in this callback, and when the callback completes, that is the data that ends up getting sent back to our client. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if we
Does the random get called now or later?
Sorry?
Does the random get called now or later?
Random gets called. That's a good question. Random gets called when the callback gets called. So when the event happens, in this case, when the timer expires, the callback is called, and that's when random is called. So this is code that runs in the future. It's in the subroutine. We're passing it a closure, basically. So now if we run this, we were running on Hypnotoad, but I'm going to run this back on Morbo, single process, right? And we're going to use the non-blocking script this time. So if I go back here and load the page, how long is it going to take for me to? It's going to take 1 second, right? There we go, 1 second. But now when I run Apache Bench, so here this is Morbo providing me some output, telling me how long the request took to execute. So it gives us a little bit of helpful input when you're developing. But if I run my Apache Bench now, it's going to return in 1 second. So it's done 10 concurrent requests at a time. They've all slept for a second, but they all returned instantly all together. And if we go back and look at our Morbo response, you can see all the 200 OKs there, and they all returned at the exact same time. So what we're seeing here is a single process that's running with an event loop that's able to accept a whole bunch of requests at once, and because we're writing our code in a non-blocking way, it can actually respond to all of them at the same time. While it's waiting for one, while one of them is sleeping, it's continuing the event loop and processing the next request that's coming in, starting it to sleep, And it does that very quickly. All 10 of them get queued up very quickly. 10 timers get created. And then the callbacks start coming in, and it starts rendering the output a second later. So we've now got 10 responses. Now, if I did this with the blocking version, we'd probably be sitting here for a while, and it would be pretty boring. But what if I do 50 requests at a time? Still takes a second. Because my browser's not, or my application's not doing anything. These timers are doing all the waiting. The application is continuously working in the background. You can go higher than that as well, but there's a limit on my laptop. It's somewhere a little bit above 150, but I can do 150 instant connections, and they all come back within about 1.2 seconds. So that's non-blocking programming in Mojolicious, yes?
So what happened compared to reporting for
It's there's still just one thread going on. It's just in an event loop. So yeah. But this also works with Hypnotoad in pre-forking mode as well. So you can fork off 10 workers, and then I could probably do 1,000 requests, and they would all return instantly because they get spread out across all those 10 workers.
Now, let's take an example. Yours is very simple because it happens very quickly.
Yes. Very good timing.
What happens if one of the things that is queued up to do render later takes a long time?
Then the whole system blocks. So as soon as you do something,
When one one gets triggered and starts, it has to
finish.
Before it gets on to the next.
Yes.
Which is different than a 314
Yes.
thread thing.
Yes. So as soon as you start doing blocking operations, and they take a long time, you're still running. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to be doing more complex stuff than this. But as soon as you do that, it's still a single process that's running. So if your computation is taking a long time, then nothing else can happen at the same time. So there's specific instances where this structure is useful, but it's not always usable. If you're doing complex computations on this system, it's not going to help you unless, and what you can do is offload that to another server. And I'll show you some examples of where you can do that. You can make a request to an other server, and it may take a while for that response to come back, but your application is still churning out more results. Okay? Yes?
If the one computation involved I/O, though, each time it was starting an I/O, somebody else could go with the same.
Yes. So if
Kind of short computation.
Well, the other thing is also file I/O.
exactly.
You can't, the standard non-blocking model doesn't support file I/O. Like if you say, the non-blocking way, is this file ready to read? You just always say yes, even if actually reading through would cause the process to block. There's some not very well supported asynchronous I/O positive extensions to posits, but file I/O is totally possible. Doesn't work non-blocking I/O.
Any other questions, or shall we move on? Okay. Let's look at another module that hasn't been talked about, Mojo PG. Now, everybody here has probably used DBI and the DVD modules, and many of you have probably used object relational mappers like DBIX class, or if you're old enough, class DBI. Those can be used in Mojolicious as well, but they're not supported directly. You can add them in and use them yourself. But what Mojolicious does provide is a module called Mojo PG, which is a separate download, but it's an easy install, and it uses DBI and it uses DVD PG to do its work, but it gives you a bit of a simpler wrapper around it. Specifically for Postgres databases. It's a very simple interface. It's not object-based in the way that DYX class is, where it creates objects for your tables and rows. It manages database handles for you, and it supports database migrations as well. So if you have new versions or table changes, there's mechanisms in there to allow you to automatically upgrade those. And it supports non-blocking queries. So we can make a call to the database and not block our application. So what we can do here, we again have a very simple Mojolicious Lite application, and this time I'm using Mojo PG as well. And what I've done at the top is created a helper. Helpers are used quite often in Mojolicious to give you access to something that's useful to you. In this case, it gives me access to a Mojo PG object. And I can access it anywhere in the application if I'm in a controller or even if I'm in a template. If I want to get access to it, I can access the helper to get to it. So you can see in the code here, in my GET request, I'm calling on my controller object, I'm calling the PG helper, and it's returning me a Mojo PG object, and then I'm asking for the database part of that. And I'm going to create an SQL statement, and again, instead of creating a test database that returns slow data, I'm just doing a sleep in my Postgres statement because it's easier. And what I'm doing here is, again, I'm rendering some JSON, but I'm calling the query, passing my SQL statement, and then I'm asking it to return to me as a hash. So the MojoDB object is very data-oriented. It renders queries, and you can loop through them one by one, getting a hash of data or an array of data, or you can tell it to give me all of it, or give me the first. And what it ends up doing as well is it returns Mojo collection objects, which give you that whole powerful array of tools to manipulate that data and get at exactly what you want. So in this case, we're just returning it as a hash, and but this is a blocking call. This will execute the statement, the database query. It'll wait for the response, and then it'll render it as JSON and send it to the screen. So again, when we make this call, it's going to take a second for us to get that response. And if we call it multiple times, we're going to be blocking every time. Yes?
So in your helper function, you've got the keyword state.
That yeah, it's a state variable, which means it's. I better not explain it because I'll explain it wrong. But it's like a my variable, and it's like an hour. Exactly. It's like an hour, but you can use it. Read the docs on it to get exactly what it is, because it's again one of those. Yeah.
In the subroutine, you use the my variable, to create each time the subroutine is executed. So you would never accumulate an increment. And if you use state, define the variable, state variable, the first time through it's null, but the subsequent time through, let's say you add one to it, so the next time through you drop that one value.
It's a good question. So I'm not going to run these programs. They're going to work exactly the same way. If anyone wants to see them afterwards, I'll do it. But it's going to effectively work the exact same way that the timer ones that I did earlier. So how can we improve this to use non-blocking calls? And as we did with the timer, we need a callback. We need to be able to return immediately and then pass it a function and tell it to do something with the results of that function. So we get rid of that and move in. Still a call to query, but we're kind of flipping it around. Instead of calling render and then having the query call inside of it, we're now calling the query and passing it a subroutine again. So we call the query object, pass in our statement, and the second value that we pass in is our callback function. So this immediately returns and completes, and then waits for the callback to be executed. Once the query has some results, our callback gets called and it gets past these three values. So you get the database handle again, you get an error value if there is one, and we get a results object.
You need to render later there?
Sorry?
You need to render later.
Very good. I was hoping someone would pick that up. You do and you don't. It's best to put it in there, but Mojo will do the right thing if you don't have a template for it to render. But if you happen to have an index template somewhere in your code, it'll render that. So if you return from it, it'll look at your function calls and your routes and try to figure out what template you want to render, and it'll pick that up. So your best bet is to always have that render later value there, and that tells it, don't do any automatic rendering, I'm going to do it myself later.
Using Perl to write JavaScript.
Exactly. It's very similar to JavaScript in the way that we make these calls. So again, we get our results object, we call hash on it, we pass it to JSON, and we render it. And it works exactly the same way as the previous version, except we now have a non-blocking version, and we can call this as many times as our database will deal with it. So if your database is taking a second or more to render your results, and it's running on the same system that this is running on, you're not going to get much of a benefit out of this, because your database has still got to execute all these queries and take all of its time to do that, and it's going to slow everything down because of that. So this is more useful if you have multiple databases or if you have a powerful database sitting somewhere else. So it's more geared towards offloading your computations off on other servers. The other limitation that you have with the database handle is you can only run one asynchronous query on each database handle. So if that code is running in the event loop and I make 10 concurrent calls to that code, it's going to make 10 connections to the database to execute my query. It can't do it on one because you still only have the one communication channel to your database to send that asynchronous call to. So there's a bit of a limitation there as well, and you need to be careful that you don't run out of database handles if you're throwing too much at it. Yes?
That's kind of an off topic to that. Do you know if Postgres, if they're ever working like supporting with multiplex,
through one database connection? I don't know. It would be pretty amazing if they could do that, but I'm not sure. I think there is actually a PG database driver for Postgres that has all of the low-level C library support from libpg. And not all of that is in dbdpg, so it might be worthwhile looking at that. I know it supports all the asynchronous calls that Postgres supports. So that's sort of the reference implementation of libpq, actually, I think it is the Postgres library. dbdpg is more geared towards what does DBI need to communicate with this database. Yes?
So if you got rid of the state in there, then each time you request a new database connection, so would that work? If you have like connections, database, and
yeah. Yes. So if you, I believe if you called Mojo PG new multiple times, you could get multiple database handles. I haven't tested this, but I would suspect that that would work. So you get multiple connections, and you could run two of these queries at the same time. You'd have two separate callbacks to deal with the results, and you'd have to gather those up somehow.
This is an additional note. If you have the state in there and you're using the same connection, probably repetitions transactions, as multiple requests are going to be using the same.
It handles that behind the scenes for you. So it makes sure that that doesn't happen. It also has protection if you fork your code. So it'll reopen database connections if you fork as well. So it has some built-in logic behind it to make sure that you're not duplicating that database use, that you're not double handling it. So it does fully support transactions as well. So you can call $db, $db begin, and then commit and roll back on it. Any other questions? Mojo User Agent. We already got a very good introduction to it. So I will skip some of this, but it also supports non-blocking access, which is good because fetching web pages takes time. We like things to happen in microseconds in our applications, and with web servers, you're dealing in milliseconds, and if they're really crappy, even longer. So non-blocking calls are handy for us to be able to make external calls and do them efficiently. So here's an example of using the user agent. So let's say we wanted to pull down some the latest blogs from some authors that we know. So what I've done is I've just created a couple variables up here with some users. And what I'm doing here is I'm just looping through these authors and firing off user agent requests. So I'm doing a get to the author, and then as we saw with Pete's presentation, we're getting a result object, turning that into a DOM object, calling find on it, and finding H2 tags that have an A inside it, and then we're mapping that to get the text out of it, which is giving us just the content within that A tag, and then we're just grabbing the first one. So we're going to get the title of the first blog article for each of these authors, and then we're rendering them as JSON. So it's pretty simple, not very useful, but it shows what we can do here. So what we need to do now is turn this into a non-blocking call. So what we can do is we again have to flip it around. So here we're looping through the authors and calling the user agent. Now we're calling the user agent and then looping through the authors. Or in this case, we're actually only doing the first one. We have a bit of a problem here. So we're getting the URL, passing in our callback subroutine, and then once we have the article that we're interested in, well, we're finished in our callback now, and normally what we do then is we render. But we've only done one author so far. If we duplicated this and called this again in a loop, well, we're going to end up with 2 calls to get a web page, and we're going to have 2 callbacks. So which callback is going to render our output? That doesn't really work. We can only have one callback that actually renders our response. Otherwise, the first one that finishes wins, and you never get the rest of the data. So we need to find a way to make this work. So we can do it this way. In our callback, once we get a callback response, we just make a new one and have a callback from that. And then in the second one, we do our rendering. But we had 3, so we would need 3 of those. And if we wanted another one, well, we'd have 4 of them, and you get into this massive callback hell where you have a callback that makes a new non-blocking transaction, and it has another callback which creates a new transaction. We have another huge limitation here. The reason we're using non-blocking calls is because we know web pages are slow to load. We're doing these sequentially. So you're making a call, waiting for the web page to respond, and executing the callback. And then we're making the next call for the next web page, waiting for it to finish, and then sending the third one. So we're waiting for each of these web pages to load before we're actually rendering our output, which is going to be potentially more than, well, it will be more than a second because it's going to be at least a quarter second for each of those to respond. So we need a way to be able to run these all at the same time, but we need to be able to render our output at the end once they've all completed. And there's some nice helpers for us to do this, and it's called the Mojo IO loop delay object. So Mojo IO loop is the event loop, and it has this module called Mojo IO loop delay, which helps us in doing multiple calls and having them happen at the same time, gathering up the results, and allowing us to complete it. So the first thing we do when we get a delay object is we register a finish callback. This gets called when everything is completed. Then we make some non-blocking calls, and for every non-blocking call we make, we call a method called begin on this delay object. And we can do this as many times as we want. So we can start a process, a non-blocking process, call begin. Start another one, call begin again. And what we need to do is in the callback, we need to make sure we call end. And what this does is every time you call begin, it increments a counter. And every time you call end, it decrements the counter. And once the counter gets to 0, we call our finish routine. So it works kind of like a semaphore does. We're increasing, we can decrease it and increase it some more. And as soon as that counter hits 0, it knows that we're finished, and it calls our finish function, or callback, sorry. Does that make sense? So here's an example of that. It's, again, the same the same program. We're trying to solve the same issue here. And in this case, we are creating this delay object here. And the first thing we do is we set up our finish callback. So we call delay on, and the event is finished, and then we execute this block of code. We'll come back to that in a second. And then after we set up our finish block, what we're doing now is we're making our user agent calls to our URLs. We're looping for all the authors. So for every author, we're making a GET request. Except we no longer have our callback function. We're calling delay begin in there instead. And then we have our render later. And that's it. So I mentioned earlier that you have to call end when you finish your callback. Now, the way this is set up and works is it ends up doing that for you. Now, our traditional callback would have gone here, where we would do our parsing of the data, rendering our output, and sending it off. Instead, we're calling delay begin, and it returns a callback for us. So it returns a subroutine reference, and that subroutine reference by default calls end for us on the delay object, which decrements the counter. It also takes whatever output the callback gets, and it queues it up for us. So it stuffs it away and saves it for us. So we fire off 3 requests, and eventually, once they finish, that subroutine that gets created gets executed, queues up our response objects, and then it calls finish. So when this executes, we're going to get a bunch of transaction objects from our UA. So the TX object that you were looking at before, so the results of our GET call. And we can look through those. So this is a transaction object. We're going to have 3 of them here. We're going to call res, dom, find, map, and grab the first line again. So we're going to have a list of our 3 articles, and we're render now, and our output comes back. And this is happening all at the same time. So this makes 3 web requests all in a row, all at the same time. They all fire off at the same time. They could come back in different orders. We can't guarantee what order they come back in. Whichever one comes first will be the first value that we get in our finish object. Yes?
Probably super. Considering you're calling delay begin, I think it's the first time.
Yes.
Is there a race condition for the next begin is called? If the first callback finishes before the next begin is called?
Well, what's happening here? There isn't. I think you have to wait until. It's a good question. And I don't think there is an issue, but it is.
I would guess that when you allocate delay, it gives you a get race free, and when the delay goes out of scope, then it does the end.
It's going to happen until the delay runs.
Yeah, the delay doesn't go out of scope until it's still accessed in this closure here as well. So the delay doesn't finish doesn't disappear until the finish function disappears. That's a very good question, and it's something that I might have to look into.
People begin before you set up the on finish?
I don't know if you can. I think it's best to set your finish first. But I'm not sure what it does otherwise. I think it'll just throw all your data away because it has it doesn't know what to do with it.
And also, is there a way to make a guarantee order? Like you cannot wait for all of them somehow.
Yes, we'll get to that in a minute.
Doesn't app start the event loop?
That's when the event loop starts, yes.
So nothing's going to happen until you reach app start. So all the gets are queued
But
up.
that's true, but once your app starts, the request hasn't come in yet. So once the request comes in, that's when it sends up the delay object, and that's when it calls this multiple times.
I suspect that all the gets will be queued up first before the responses get queued up in the event loop process.
Yes.
So all the gets will happen first, therefore all the delayed gets will happen first before the first response gets processed.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Because basically, in this case, it wouldn't.
Yes.
That's
Actually, you're right. That must happen because because we're still in the single process. This is going to finish executing, and once this loop is done, it's going to finish the function, and then we get the next tick, and now it starts looking at the next item in the event loop to process. So yes, we've worked our way through it. So it will work properly. Did that make sense?
Yeah. App start is the browser.
App start is the application.
It's the server.
That's when the server begins. Yeah.
So then the request comes in and it does the get subroutine.
Yes, the request comes in after that.
I'm curious why you have to render later. You can set up earlier.
Doesn't matter where it comes. So as long as it gets called before the function finishes, you're fine. So now I have all three cases of it. Call it early, don't call it at all, call it at the end. Doesn't matter where it happens. Any other questions on this? Yes?
So one of the big problems I've always experienced with asynchronous applications like this, that especially that do some other service, the call out to some other service and the risk is error handling, right? That's always been really common.
Yes.
Like so, for example, how do you match up? You know, suppose one of those requests fails or something. How do you map that up to the original response and return it?
That's a very good question. I covered error handling very briefly at the end.
Oh,
maybe we'll look at it then. But it is definitely an issue with this because your errors are happening not here; they're happening in the event loop. So they're happening outside of your call here. This function finishes very quickly, and then your code is running somewhere else completely. So if an error gets thrown, there's nothing in here to handle it. So you need to deal with that in some way, and there are a couple of ways that you can deal with it with Mojolicious. Any other questions? Or
If there were no errors, you still want to be able to know which one was which.
Well, you can look at the because you're getting, in this case, you're getting transaction objects back. So you can look at what requests it was for. So it'll tell you what URL the request was for. So if you need to sort them afterwards, you can, based on whatever criteria you have. So you can't guarantee what order they're coming in, but there's nothing stopping you from sorting them once you get to the finish callback. You can reorganize the data and do with it what you want at that point. The point of the delay object is it gets you that data all together in a single callback, and then you can do what you need to do to process that data. Okay? Now there was one more thing that's missing from this, this setup, and that's what Pete was hinting at. What if you need to do a non-blocking call, and then the second non-blocking call you do actually needs the data from the first one before you can actually complete it? So you need to be able to structure them somehow and say, I want to make a call here, get some data from it, and then make some other non-blocking calls. So in a structure like this, you can't do that because we're basically firing off all the non-blocking calls in one go, and then we get all the data in one go afterwards. So there's no chance for you to get any data from it to pass on to the next one. That's effectively what it is, but it's still basically what we do instead is there is a method inside IO loop delay called steps, and you can pass it multiple functions. Now, Mojolicious actually has a helper function in the base class that makes this very easy to use, and I'll show you that way instead. So here is our next version of the code, and in this case, what we're going to do is instead of hard coding the names, we're going to pull them from the database. And again, I was too lazy to create a table in my database, so my SQL query is just returning a result set that I've stuck in the query itself. That's all it's doing. So that SQL statement is going to return 3 rows, 1 column. Okay? So pretend that that is a select star from blog users. We again have our helper, which is the same as it was before. And now, when we get into our subroutine, instead of creating a new delay object, we're going to call the delay method, which is part of our core Mojo package, a function that Mojo provides us. And in this delay object, we actually have multiple subroutines now. Instead of just passing one subroutine, we're passing a number of steps. And what we have here is this set of calls needs to finish before that one can start. Then these ones need to finish before that one starts. And the last one is going to be our callback, our finish callback. So you can have as many functions that you pass to this delay object, and they each have to complete in their own way. And they complete by using the delay object, which is passed in, and calling begin on it. And once the counter gets down to 0 again, i.e. this callback finishes, it now executes the next function, where we call delay a bunch of times, delay begin a bunch of times. And once all of these, once this counter gets down to 0 again, it jumps to the next function. And it keeps doing that until it gets to the last function, and at that point we can return our results. So we're calling our database query here, and what's going to happen is when this callback gets called, the results of this query get passed on to the next function. So in here, we're getting the parameters from the previous call. So we're getting our error object, and we're getting a results object. And with that results object, all I'm doing here is I'm returning it as arrays, which turns it into a Mojo collection, and then flattening it so that I just have a simple list of the names that I pulled out of the database. And again, I'm calling those URLs on those usernames. And we're calling delay begin, however many users were in there, so in this case 3 times. And then when this completes, all of the results from all of these calls get passed into here, which gets us our articles like we did the last time, and we render our JSON and we finish. So now we can have a step-by-step process. All of this is still completely non-blocking. So when you execute this, this function finishes instantly, but internally, it waits for these callbacks to finish before executing that, and it waits for those callbacks to finish to execute the last one.
I actually have a situation which is in between. I need to fetch 2 files, so that can happen in parallel.
Yeah.
But one of them needs to be processed into some sort of data structure before the second one can be processed using the data from there. So this would be too sequential. Because,
well, you could still do that, because in this first subroutine, you could ask it to load both files, which means both of them would be available at this point, and you could process the first one. And then we could pass that data on to the next one. So you could pass the one file that you can't process yet, and pass it on to the next function, and then do your processing in a non-logging way, and its results will also get passed to the next function. So there's some extra methods as part of the delay object that can help you to do that. There's a method called pass, and you can give it anything, and that whatever you send to that function, that pass function, gets delivered to this next function. There's also a data method that allows you to set some values and then access them later on as well. And there's some more advanced features as well. If we, in this case here, we're getting an error and results object. If we only wanted the results object, we don't because we need to be checking for errors. But if for some reason we only wanted the results object, you can actually pass a parameter to begin to tell it which response variables or what return variables this call gives you, which ones you actually want. So I want from 2 to 3, or I want the second one, the fourth one. And it'll only pass those return values on to the next one so that you can save a bit of memory or that. This is not necessarily memory friendly because we're going to end up with 3 full DOM or 3 full web transaction objects, and we're not processing them until we get down to here. So we're using up a bit of memory to gain a bit of speed.
So, question, let's say you're in the that middle sub there, and you look at your error, and you're like, oh, crap, the database failed. How do you abort processing at that point? How would that one you die, and then where would that error go?
You can die. Yeah, or you can always die. Dying is always an option. It is. You can catch your errors within a valve lock as well if you want.
But so if you die here though, there's nowhere to return that error to, right?
There is a default error callback that you can register. So we previously registered a finish callback. You can actually register an error callback as well, and that will get called if any error happens, and you can look at the error object that it returns and figure out. You still have to figure out which callback died on you, and it does get a little bit tricky because you're not doing procedural programming here. You're jumping around, and you don't necessarily know where you were when the code died. I think I'm almost at the error page. Oh, wait, no, I had one more use case. Were there any more questions on this last one before I move on, actually? Yes.
This list of subs is basically batch 1, batch 2, batch 3.
Exactly.
Is there a way of giving it a tree? This has to be Jesus. But it has to come after these of these and so on. So it just has to go as soon as all the prerequisites are done, it sends up the next one. It doesn't have to wait. Like
look,
in this case, if file 1 came through, you could do the conversion, but with the subs, you have to wait till file 2 comes through as well before you start converting file 1.
Yeah.
You can't see that as error.
It may be possible that you could call delay multiple times, so you could get a new delay object within a callback to then split off into different ones, but I would be wary of trying that. It's in the end, things are still being executed sequentially. It just the order in which they get executed is based on the events that happen. So you can decide what to do in here. I'm in this second set here. I'm deciding to call this user agent object and call a bunch of web pages. But you can put an if block in there and say if this response came back this way, I want to instead go and call these non-blocking function calls. Otherwise, I want to do all of these non-blocking calls. So you still have the power of Perl to make decisions in here to change the direction that you want to go in. But the subroutines...
So have to wait.
Yes, you have to wait till the round 1 is complete. Yeah. And you can't tell it to skip the next subroutine. So you'd have to have a condition in there that said, if this situation happened, maybe just pass all my data off the next function and don't call any delay begin, which means it completes instantly and moves on to the next. There's some really good examples in the documentation for this. Mojo actually has very good documentation. It gives some very interesting examples in using these tools in different ways.
when your paper was somewhere else?
This stuff is actually in the guide. So if you go to the Mojolicious cookbook, actually, if you go to the cookbook Perl docs, it has some of these examples. Not exactly like this. I kind of mixed and matched my own, but there's some good examples on how to use non-blocking code directly. Okay. So I've got one more use case to go over, and then I'm pretty much done after that. Now, at this point, we've been creating these events and callbacks inside the GET requests, but they don't have to be. You can actually put one in the global scope of your application. So when you start that application, that's when the event loop starts. Now, the event loop has automatically put a listener in there that listens on port 3000 by default for new requests, and as they come in, it puts those requests in the event loop and keeps listening for more. So it's actively doing things. We can add our own things to that event loop as well if we want to. So we could set, in the global scope, a repeating timer that looks at the timestamp of the config file and automatically reads it and updates the variables based on that. Or we could check for a file, and if that file exists, we can put our application into maintenance mode, which maybe we can change the functionality that we give to the users, and maybe we don't allow them to submit new changes to the database. We only allow them read-only access. So I'll give you a quick example of the maintenance mode one. What I've done here is I've created a new attribute and called it maintenance. So this is an attribute is kind of like a helper, but it's purely just a set value. So you can set it or and change it. That's a get set attribute. Whereas a helper is a subroutine reference that takes some action. Every time you call the helper, it executes that subroutine. This is purely just an accessor. So we create this maintenance accessor, and then immediately after, we call a recurring timer. So we use Mojo loop recurring, and every 5 seconds, I want Mojo, or I want my application, to run this function. So regardless of when requests are coming in, or regardless of what's happening, as long as my application is running and sitting there, and that event loop is churning over, waiting for new connections to come in, every 5 seconds, it's going to run my little function here. That's going to check to see if my maintenance mode file exists, and if it does, it just flips the bit. So it changes maintenance mode to 1 for me. And elsewhere in my code, all I'm doing here is rendering a very basic template. In my template, I'm just looking for the value of maintenance, and if it's set, it puts a big line at the top saying maintenance mode. And obviously, you can use that elsewhere in your code as well to disable routes. If you have a whole list of routes, you can split them off and say these ones are writable routes, these are readable routes. And then if maintenance mode is set, these routes no longer exist, and we can redirect them to a holding page that says the site's currently in maintenance mode, so please come back later. And that's, I'll go back to my command line just to show you quickly how that one works. So here's the application that I had in the slide. Morbo, IAP. Oh no, I have it running somewhere else. There we go. Rid of that one. Okay. So if we go back here and we reload this, it's just showing our standard message that was in the template. I can reload it multiple times, nothing's happening. And if I go here and I put my maintenance mode in place, reload, I have to wait a couple seconds. Oh, now it's in maintenance mode. So all I've had to do is touch a file, and now my whole application has changed. And as soon as I move that file out of the way, the opposite will happen. So if I go move it out of the way again, okay, still in maintenance mode, and now it's back, and we're good again. So we didn't have to stop and start the application. We can change it from within, and It's not too expensive for every 5 seconds, or you could even do it every minute. I didn't want to wait a minute for my demo, so to check for a file, or you could do something else as well. You could check for a record in the database and make a change based on that. Any questions on that?
You gonna post the slides for this?
I can do that, yes. Error handling. Sorry, go ahead.
Mojo handle signaling.
Signaling,
Signals.
yes. But I believe it asks you not to play around with signals too much because it uses them internally, I think. So,
Because rather than waiting 5 seconds,
you can definitely do that as well. You can
signal when you got it.
Yes.
Do it only once.
But when you're working with event loops, a lot of them, they can hook into signal handlers as well to manage all of this stuff. Like you could do a sig user 1 or user 2 or something like that and look for that as well. You could put those into play. I'm sure you could.
I feel like the best way to handle that is to hook I know
Yes.
a lot of send an event through your process when files are changing.
Yeah.
In this case, directors modify them. So you can handle it immediately.
You can actually do that with through your database as well with MojoDB. You can do listen and notify on that as well. So you can actually in your database call a notification and it will go out to your application if it's connected to the database, and it will send it a notification and it can act on that as well. So yeah, there's a few options. This was more of an example of what you could do with timers. There's lots of different things that you can do with it. Okay. I didn't cover a huge amount on error handling, mainly because I wanted my examples to be small and succinct. But there is the issue that we mentioned previously. What if your callback dies? If you use that delay method, that delay call, it automatically sets up a default error handler for you, and it calls Mojo's built-in render exception, which gives you that pretty error page if you're in development. If you're in production, I'm not 100% sure what it gives you, but you can control it. You can control what it does, but it basically returns a standard error. If you don't like that, if you don't have that, your browser will time out. So if there's no error handler there, then the callback may fail, which means that your render callback never gets called, which means nothing ever gets rendered. And eventually, the connection times out, and you get a zero response from your browser. So that's not good. So you need to make sure you have an error handler there that does something. So by default, in that delay call, it sets up a default error handler that returns the standard. If your application dies, this is what you get in Mojolicious. Now you can override that by setting an error callback. So you can create, on that delay object, you can call on error, call my function. And in that function, again, it's up to you to decide what you want to do. You can throw another error, or you can look at what error came in and try to handle it, maybe redirect them off to another page with an error message, and try again. But it's up to you to decide what to do in case that error happens. Or you can try and catch the errors in your callback as well, make sure that you're not actually executing anything that's going to die. Yes?
Where would you set the delay on error? All the way outside like 3 minutes?
That's a good question. Where was our example here? What you can do is when you call cdelay, when you call cdelay, the return value of that function is the delay object again. So you can chain it at the end and call on error and pass it something, and then chain it again with another call. Where were we? Okay. So I don't have any actual examples on errors because you guys should deal with your own errors. I don't want to have to deal with them. But there are definitely systems in place to catch them and to handle them. But it is a significant problem with non-blocking event loop-based code, that the error can happen outside of where you're actually writing your code, and it can be tricky to handle all of the errors that could happen. So that's it. There's really, event loops aren't useful in all situations. There's some unique places where they are very useful, like in our example when we're doing non-blocking database calls or web requests. It's effectively offloading the weighting to the external servers. So if all you're doing is non-blocking calls to long-running processes on your system's still going to be slow. Effectively, it's going to help your application churn along, but it's most useful by offloading these things on other systems. Yeah, that's my talk. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've heard some. I haven't really looked into it too yet, but I was wondering one thing about Mojolicious. What extent is it compatible with?
Very good. I knew I was going to miss something. It's fully compatible with any event, and internally, it will sometimes load other event modules if they're available on the system. So it can work with EV, and it can work with most of the event objects that are out there. So it implements all of its stuff through the AnyEvent framework, or at least it's compatible with it. So if it sees that it's loaded, it will use it, which means it'll work with other event loop frameworks concurrently.
I'm unfortunately I have this issue for avoiding, and this is kind of the point of any event itself, right? Loop it, actually link into any
Exactly.
module.
Yeah.
They call it the API of the event.
It is, yeah.
And it's really great about that.
Yeah.
Last time I looked at it, yeah, like you could maybe use EV or the Mojo homebrew one, but those are your own copy. If you wanted to use Mojo inside like IRSSIs and something like that, any event is having compatible adapter. But as far as I understood last time, Mojolicious supports EV and its own homebrew one.
No, it supports more now. So it will use, as long as the event loop supports any event, I think Mojo can use it. So I haven't tried them all myself, but on the documentation it does mention that it's compatible with all the other ones. As long as your other event loops are compatible with any event, then Mojo will work with it. So I think it has its own event loop built in internally, because that's the Mojo way. Build it all yourself, but it tries to play nice with other things as well. Well, what we've shown today is mostly what Mojolicious provides, but if you don't like the templating language, use Template Toolkit. If you don't like the Mojo PG for database access, use DBIX class. It doesn't stop you from using them. It just provides its own ecosystem of modules that work really well together.
Is the PG module, is that Postgres specific? Or
Yes. It's only for Postgres. There's another, and it's mainly because Postgres has non-blocking support, that I think they use that, and because it's the best database out there as well. There is another non-blocking database. No, MongoDB, there's a non-blocking driver for Mojo to access MongoDB in a non-blocking way as well. So that's the other one that's heavily used in Mojolicious. But I'm not sure if MySQL has good non-blocking support. If it does, I'm sure someone will eventually build a non-blocking driver for it as well.
Maybe just plug on my own modules. I have this module called AnyEvent Task. And if you actually look at the synopsis, one of the examples is how to use EDI. In other words, with any database whatsoever, I actually use DB2 and so on, from an asynchronous application. And so it's any application that uses AnyEvent, you can use any other non-blocking call. Yeah, like the two examples of the synopsis are password hashing, which is a CPU-intensive thing that would normally block your event loop. AnyEvent Task, the way it works is that it has forked off processes, and you connected them, and it's kind of like off work to process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also supports like transactions, like you can get a exclusive lock on the worker process while you're doing your database transaction. And you know, it's all done asynchronously. So
Nice.
you just want connections, like say it's a web connection, one of hundreds of other web processes. Have an exclusive lock for the duration of the transaction on one of these dedicated worker processes. So yeah, you can interact with the API very nicely.
Very nice. And that's why if you want to use event loops, you don't want to write your own, because you need to write for control and, and stuff like that, and it can get very very hairy. So it's much better to use existing event loops that are out there, and there are many of them that are available. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone. So just a bit of housekeeping. Next month, our talk is machine learning with Perl. Still possibly looking for one other speaker if anybody has a short topic that they want to discuss. And then in December, it's just a social. Dave, do we know where we're living?
We should be good.
Back. Okay. All right, cool. Anybody have anything else? Anybody going out afterwards?
Here, if anybody here is looking for a job or
All right, thanks. Man.
Yeah, fine.